Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first event in our Winter Craft speaker series, Praxes of Care, Action. My name is Jenna Cannelli, and I'm a Master of Architecture student at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. Tonight's event is called Horizontal Pedagogies in Practice. During tonight's talk, we will come together as students, educators, and practitioners of architecture to discuss how we build on the land and take care of each other. Reaching across our profession to workers' rights and how we relate to the interconnected communities around us, Care in Action includes solidarity with the Indigenous peoples defending land against privatization, against deforestation, against the poisoning of our lakes and waters, and against mining economies of extraction. The earth, understood as our first home, can reveal the many ways care practices are interconnected. I would like to bring our awareness to the land on which we live, work, and gather, acknowledging that the University of Waterloo School of Architecture is situated on the Haldeman Tract, stretching out to include 10 kilometers on either side of the waters of the Grand River, the land promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. This two-year series is dedicated to Professor Andrew Levitt, who we lost this fall. Andrew Levitt was an extraordinary, kind, and insightful mentor and friend. Our committee dedicates the series to Andrew, who spent his time at Waterloo enacting care, both in his teachings and his presence at the school. He encouraged students to curiously and compassionately explore and validate their inner worlds as essential aspects to working and shaping the outer world. In moments of insecurity about the future, about design, or about ourselves as students, Andrew inspired confidence, teaching us to look within, trust our feelings, and by suggesting that the answers we were looking for were already within us. His presence and writings helped heal my relationship with architectural education. And Mayuri and I, thinking that we speak for many more, wanted to take this time to thank and honor Andrew for listening to us as students in ways we hadn't been heard, and for teaching us to be better listeners to ourselves and the world around us. I'm forever grateful to have met and been taught by Andrew. Our community has missed him greatly these last months. Tonight, we celebrate Andrew's legacy of designing with empathy. Thank you to the lecture series committee chair Bissett, Adrian Blackwell, Julie Dring, Amanda Dudnik, Preetha Arulananthan, Jaliya Fonseka, Marie-Paule Macdonald, Mary Paranthahan, Brenda Reid, Beth, Wendy, Yuan, and Yuan. Thank you to Jaliya Nakanishi for designing the series posters, and thank you to Craft for funding the speaker series in tonight's event. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mayuri, co-organizer of Horizontal Pedagogies.
Thanks, Shannon, and welcome everyone to the first of 3 events on Horizontal Pedagogies, a segment of this term's speaker series. So Horizontal Pedagogy started out as a proposal for a graduate symposium that I wrote in 2020 when there was an uprising of calls to question the inequities produced by our institutions and professions. As a recent graduate and someone underrepresented in the field, I was left with grievances towards the cultures fostered in architecture school and in a potential future in professional practice. I came to realize that witnessing exclusivity in architecture was a shared experience and one reinforced by larger systems and legacies of power. And since 2020, there have been changes in architectural pedagogy underway, reading lists, alternative teaching methods, calls for workers' rights, and a cultural shift in the discourse describe a few examples of unlearning and relearning taking place in the profession today. As an extension of these efforts, it is my hope that the events in this series will allow us to reflect on the inequities embedded in our discipline and rethink the field through less hierarchical means. So Horizontal Pedagogies invites practitioners and educators to participate in conversations that explore more complex organizational systems in architecture. We will address the diverse interests of our speakers and examine the dismantling of power structures in their work. Their insights will allow us to envision pedagogical models in architecture that prioritize equity and inclusion and make space for silenced voices. And as we reflect on the perspectives reinforced in our discipline, it is crucial that we learn new methods of teaching, learning, practicing, thinking, and discussing architecture. And I wanted to give a quick thank you to Jaliya Nakanishi, who helped conceive the speakers for tonight's event, as well as Adrian Blackwell, Jaliya Fonseka, and the lecture series committee for their help in putting this segment of the speaker series together. And it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Reza Nik. Reza is an architect, artist, and educator based in Toronto. He's the founding director of Sheep, an experimental architecture studio working at the intersection of community and culture. Reza is also an assistant professor in the teaching stream at the University of Toronto's Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. And he's also one of the co-founders of the Toronto chapter of the Architecture Lobby. Welcome, Reza, and I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for being here, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this talk with two wonderful guests. I'll do my best to keep the conversation going because I think it's a very valid conversation. So thank you for having me. And I'll just jump into it, and I'll introduce our guests, and then I'll pass over the mic to Jess first, and then Keri after that, and then we'll have a conversation afterwards, Q&A, and hopefully we'll have some questions from you as well. So Jess Myers, she, her, is an urbanist, podcaster, and editor focusing on urban planning and architecture. Jess is the series editor of Taking Freedom, a social justice book series, which will be published by a coalition of the Service Employees International Union and MIT's Community Innovators Lab. She was formerly the co-steward of the Architecture Lobby's New York chapter, a member-driven architecture group that seeks to improve labor conditions in the field. Her podcast, Here There Be Dragons, explores the intersection of security and identity politics in urban space. Thank you for being here, Jess. And Keri Monaghan, pronouns she, her, is an elected workplace organizer at United Voices of the World, section of architectural workers, and the acronym is UVW SAW. Last year, she supported members in their workplaces to walk out over coronavirus health and safety concerns and win support for working from home, and is currently supporting workers around issues like unpaid overtime and bullying. United Voices of the World section of architectural workers is a member-led trade union for workers in the UK, formed in 2019 after an 18-month workers' inquiry. Members of SAW collectively organize both in their workplaces around overwork, underpay, unstable employment, toxic workplace and university culture, discrimination, and unethical practice. They use models of worker-to-worker solidarity to hold bosses accountable. UVW SAW includes architectural assistants, model makers, BIM technicians, admin workers, architects, landscape architects, students, visualizers, researchers, receptionists, university workers, interior designers, freelancers, sole traders, from all sizes of practice and across the UK. Thank you, Keri, for being here. I'll pass it on to Jess, and we will begin with your presentation.
Hi, and thank you so much, Reza, for the introduction. I am going to just share the lobby's, the architecture lobby's landing page of their website while I'm talking about them. And then I'm going to stop sharing that and I'm going to just talk. So if that is not entertaining to you visually, please feel free to pull up the lobby's Instagram account and apply and subscribe to that, and just scroll through it while I'm chatting. So I'm gonna share screen and just speak a little bit to the architecture lobby's work as it pertains to unionization, but it's going to be difficult to decouple that from the effort that we've made during the pandemic, because as I think anyone who's working in labor or working period has experienced, the pandemic really, I think, intensified and brought up a lot of energy around labor, especially in the United States. So prior to the pandemic, the architecture lobby, which the structure of which has a national body, as well as a number of national chapters in various locations. So I'm from the New York chapter, and also a couple of international chapters as well. So at the national level, there's been for years a national unionization working group, and really what the push of that working group was to demystify, educate, and normalize conversations about unions. In the United States, unionized workers are about 10% of the workers in the US, which is down by volumes since its peak in the 1950s. Private sector workers, I believe, if I have the most present stat, are just 6% of unionized workers. So what we wanted to do was to decouple this idea that, oh, unions are for blue collar workers, unions are for factory workers, we have fancy degrees, we don't need that kind of thing. Which I think what the pandemic did was really change people's minds about what kinds of rights were necessary even in the private sector. So we do have a pamphlet for architectural workers in the United States to really review and have an understanding of, like, actually, okay, what does it take to start a union? And then in the New York chapter is the only one so far to have also a local unionization working group, because as I'm sure you can feel, labor is often a very local issue, and often has local histories and local sets of support and antagonism to work with. So on the local level, what we did was essentially do a campaign of just calling everyone in the New York area whose contact we had, who had shown interest in the lobby, and just taking time to speak with them about what specifically in your firm, or what specifically in your working conditions is really causing struggle for you. So from doing that effort, we could have a more expansive understanding of specifically what issues were the most pressing for architectural workers in New York. And then the pandemic happened, which made this intensity and the severity of not having worker power more apparent. So it's really wonderful to hear about the walkout that you organized, because I'm sure that many American workers would have really appreciated already having the power in play to be able to do that, because it really would have impacted things like being able to decide when to start working remotely, being able to sort of work with allied sectors to create safety on, let's say, work sites, for example. Also, it would have made the negotiations for the terms of returning to work a bit easier. Things like mask mandates and distancing in the workplace, which American architectural workers did not have. So essentially what the lobby did was to lay out a effort of programming to really help have candid conversations about sort of what it takes to start a union in the US. We also created programming for students, because I think, and as I'll talk about a little bit later, a lot of what we understand about architectural work begins to start being normalized in school. So what we wanted to do what we ended up doing when the pandemic hit and most people were locked down, or most people working in firms had been locked down and had moved into remote work, was to think about ways of connecting students who are graduating in 2020 to practitioners who had graduated in 2008. So we called it the Recession Roundtable, and we really sat down and had these candid conversations about, what did you do to survive, just coming out into the workplace in a time when there was just a contraction of the market, and there was, not a lot of work, and what sort of tactics people use. And I think that there was a kind of relief to be able to talk openly and candidly about that. after we followed that up with a education cycle about unions again, because again, for practitioners who are already in the field and facing pressures from their offices, we wanted to really make clear these are the rights that are available to you. We also led a delegation to Jane McAlevy's strike school. So Jane McAlevy in the US is a major voice in the labor movement who has made it really an effort to train many unionized and non-unionized workers in how to use these mechanisms of workers' rights. So from there, very excitingly, an entire year later, I'm sure that you've heard that shop architects in New York has just become public about having a union drive. So right after that happened, we had another programming event that was sort of, again, open education about unionization, but this time having the ability to invite the Machinists, union's first organizer dedicated to architecture, which was very exciting for us to have this ally and to be able to really start building up this muscle within unions themselves, that were really starting to pay attention to what does it take to organize for architectural workers in the US. So I'm going to stop sharing now. From there, I want to talk a little bit about, I know this is not the teaching panel, but I'm going to just slip in a couple of minutes about it, because I am an assistant professor at the Rhode Island School of Design. And I think that sometimes when you are in academia, there's this question of okay, well, what is my place in this effort, in the effort to sort of to organize our workers in the private sector? And I think that there's a huge place for academics. So one being that I am now co-teaching the professional practice seminar. And I think that this particular seminar, which is often structured in the US as a way of training students about how to run an architecture firm, which is, great knowledge, but when you graduate, it's often, maybe if you're lucky, 25, 30 years out from really using that. So how we're trying to restructure the understanding of training graduating students for professional practice is to add this piece called labor literacy, and to start, again, normalizing and educating on what does it take to organize a union in the United States, and what are workers' rights, but also to use that as a conversation with students about what do you want out of your working life, and to not put it as how famous do you want to be, or how rich do you want to be, or how well known do you want to be, how many Instagram followers do you want? No, it's really think about your working life. And students have some real constraints, right? So in the United States, I'm often graduating students with 6 figures of debt, right? Or I'm graduating students who we have a lot of international students, for example, and the policy in the US is when you graduate, you have a certain amount of years to work in the United States, but you can only work within your degree, right? So if you get a degree in architecture and you can't find a job in architecture, then you're out of luck, because you are technically violating the terms of your visa if you work outside of that. So what that ends up doing is it creates, on top of already training students to pull all-nighters, on top of already training students to sort of elbow each other in competition, we've essentially trained up an easily exploitable workforce, right? So you enter the field, you have this debt that you have to respond to immediately. You're going to get that email a month after you graduate. And then on top of that, if you're also an international student, you also have that constraint from your visa. So if you get a job as a worker with a visa, then your entire sort of status as a legal resident in the United States is also tied to your job. So we have people that we have students that we are essentially releasing into the workforce as extremely vulnerable, exploitable workers. So what can we do as academics to ensure, because again, our salaries are tied to that debt, right? It's I think our responsibility as educators to talk about workers' rights, to talk about worker power, and to talk about unionization. So we're ensuring to seed that into the professional practice seminar alongside negotiations and negotiations training and financial literacy training. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the sector, and I'm going to wrap up after that, is that the unionization effort that's happening right now at SHOP is particularly exciting because, as Peggy Deemer has written about, this is the first unionization drive in the United States in a private sector firm since the 1970s, when SOM San Francisco branch actually had a drive but failed to materialize a union. So if SHOP is actually successful in unionizing, they would be the first private sector architecture union in the United States since the 1930s. So again, while I really support this goal, I also understand that it's not a magical solution to the way that work culture in US firms is set up. The hardest work actually, as you can say of any revolutionary act, the hardest work comes after. How are you going to work with your coworkers to create an equitable contract, to negotiate with them, to put everybody's needs on the table? And I heard once at a talk given by Kate Wagner, the writer and editor of McMansion Hell, she once, and I think here she's amending a phrase from Marx, said that, most architects see themselves as temporarily embarrassed firm owners. And while there's some truth in that, as someone who's talked to a lot of architects about their material needs, and people often compare, their salaries to, why aren't we making what doctors and lawyers are making, and can sometimes end their critique there, I would actually nuance that statement a little bit and talk a little bit about, most people, architects included, have a very intimate understanding of their material circumstances and material constraints. So things like debt, health, caretaking work that you have to do, immigration, all of these things can create circumstances where you're trying to survive within those constraints, right? But at the same time, something that my partner talks a lot about is that capitalism is extremely talented about confusing you as to what exactly is trying to kill you, right? So what we have sort of trained architects into doing in order to survive is to always bring their workplace concerns to their principal, right? So try to cut a deal and get an accommodation from your principal, and maybe that you'll be able to improve your conditions somewhat, right? Maybe you'll be able to get a couple more weeks of parental leave or something like this, right? But that condition becomes only something that's codified for you, and only so long as your relationship with that partner holds, and only so long as that partner stays, right? So there's a lot of precarity in that. So we've already sort of trained architects to have this understanding that accommodations are scarce, and that they need to be in sort of competition with their coworkers, sort of scrabbling with their coworkers, rather than talking to their coworkers and sort of like understanding how your needs connect, right? So I think that what we need to understand here is training architects to have a more relational understanding of their peers, or opening up this capacity to have more frank and candid discussions with your peers about, what your material circumstances are, because you find that there's you have a lot of overlap, right? And that you can see and start to build power with your coworkers rather than waiting on permission from a supervisor or a partner. And I often, I say a lot in the lobby when I'm talking to architects that I wish that more architects would join like a community garden or some sort of mutual aid thing, because it really helps to work towards a goal of common good with people who annoy the shit out of you. Because the thing is about unions that are really interesting is they kind of negate this idea of removal or sort of scarcity, meaning that you have to leave, rather than being able to find a way through relation to create abundance, right? So unions are saying that, you may be in this struggle with your supervisor in order to win the contract, but you're in that struggle because you want to stay, right? You're not trying to leave. This is often, an argument in the United States, is that the union is trying to destroy the firm. That's what it's trying to do. But why would anyone put so much effort into trying to remain in a place that they're trying to destroy? So this idea of having a seat at the table and having a place to negotiate in your workplace, having the ability to have the power to negotiate the terms of your working life, right? Being something that you build up through relation. And a union is really only as good as those relations can be, which I can definitely speak to as someone who's in an academic union myself. So the last thing that I want to touch on is, in order for these relations to be strong, and in order for a union to succeed in the private sector in architecture, there also has to be an abandonment of our current system of validation, which is, again, something that we seed in architecture school, right? You're in competition with your peers in order to win the special approval of your professor, right? Which we then transfer into trying to be, the person who's winning special approval from your supervisor. And it's because you're so good, and it's because you're a better designer than them. It's because you've done more unpaid overtime than them, and I would love us to stop saying unpaid overtime and talking about it more as wages that you're donating to a firm, right? These are hours that you have not been compensated for under a contract, right? So in order for the union to work, you have to push beyond the system of validation that means that you are trying to scrabble for individual recognition, right? And that the recognition that you get, rather, the benefits that you get, rather, are for everyone, that you are scrabbling or struggling or negotiating for the benefits that were once sort of these special treats that were sort of sparingly given out as being the standard of your workplace, and sort of building and understanding that, you don't have to be best friends with your coworkers. You just have to understand that your circumstances are tied together, right? Which means that you have to forego this understanding of like, a benefit is a treat just for me, or it's a prize or a reward just for me. And rather, this should be the standard of working life in the sector, right? So I'm going to stop there and pass it to Keri.
Amazing. Thank you, Jess. That was great. Yes, please, Keri, jump in.
Thank you, Reza. And Jess, thanks. That was really inspiring. And I think there's probably plenty of overlaps in what you've said just now and what I'm about to speak to. So yeah, I'm glad of that we seem to be on message. So let me just see if I can share my screen. So hi all, my name's Keri, and I am phoning in this evening from Scotland, so representing United Voices of the World in the UK, the section of architectural workers specifically. And And I think what's interesting about what Jess was just describing is about, there was plenty of things that I kind of picked up on there that ring true with the values of SAW, as we call ourselves. But one thing that struck me at the start of the conversation, Jess, was you said that we want to try and redefine unions as something that is for blue collar workers and not appropriate to us professionals with degrees. I think that's absolutely right. And something that we work very hard at with SAW is ensuring that we remain a member-led union. So we're not a sort of third-party bureaucratic sort of institutional model of a union. We are about supporting one another, largely on a volunteering basis, part of the kind of broader umbrella union of United Voices of the World, where we get legal support, representation, and resource as we need it, and also a collaboration with other working sectors that face similar precarity in their employment. So all of that is something that's really valuable and key to the sort of methodology of how we are unionising the sector in the UK. So seeing as I was kind of sharing a platform with Jess this evening, I thought actually it would be appropriate to kind of discuss this idea from that I first heard from Peggy Deemer, which was about thinking about the performance that we act out in the architectural profession. For me, that's the performance of working late, working for free, performance of competing, of practices undercutting one another, accepting unethical practices to win a bigger commission. And this kind of feeling that often, we have an uncomfortable relationship with our complicity in these things, but there's a sense of inevitability that these learned performances, they're widespread and unchangeable. But describing that relationship in a sense of performance, I think, is a really useful way to begin to assert a level of control over the behaviours, and it can turn something into a less hopeless situation by understanding that you can change the performance. And I think a lot of the work that we do within organising the union is about making people believe that change is actually possible, and then encouraging them to take the risks that are required to activate that change. So the work of SAW is hugely invested in actively changing the performance of architectural working practices and unlearning our behaviours. So we're committed to taking collective action. We want to turn exploitation into action, engage with one another to break down this competitive, individualistic culture that is so rife in the way we not only work, but as you say, Jess, are taught and trained in architectural school. So, a lot of that comes down to building a sort of tight and effective structure within our union, within our numbers, to manifest power and implement that power in the workplace. So it's kind of not just about campaigning, and I want to make that really clear. There's a key difference between mobilising and organising. We're not about self-selecting and talking about these things to a kind of inward-facing group of people. We're about actively targeting people in workplaces who might not be so convinced by these kinds of principles at first, and making them aware of their situation and aware that there's a better alternative. So what I wanted to do just this evening, this starting part, is just give you a description of SAW, how it began, why it exists, and the kind of positive changes that we're making in workplaces. So SAW was born out of an 18-month-long workers' inquiry process. A group of architectural workers and students realised that unionisation was absolutely critical to address the issues that we experience in workplace and university. So through a series of open meetings, surveys and interviews, some archival research into past efforts to unionise, they collectively kind of surveyed the architectural sector in the UK from below. And the findings of that inquiry are broadly summarised into a sort of manifesto for the union on the areas that we need to work on and change. Some of these are kind of, you know, reasonably obvious and recognisable, but no less important to summarise so that we have a target and a goal for what it is we're trying to achieve. Overwork is, you know, a very common complaint. I don't think there's any of us in the architectural profession that haven't experienced quite extreme levels of overwork. And that pressure comes directly and indirectly in practice. It's an amazing thing actually to calculate up the number of hours that you accumulate through working through your lunch break, just 1 or 2 hours extra in the evenings or over weekends. Over the course of a year, the value of that time and that money is something that is stolen from you. It's something that you have actually personally invested into a practice that doesn't give you that back. I think it's a really important message to get through to people. The pressure that comes from overwork is also an issue of exclusivity, and it's an equity issue. The pressure is magnified for people with less secure contracts during their probation periods, or people who are sponsored for a visa. We have very similar issues in the UK with visas running out, particularly with the changes following Brexit. And we've experienced a lot of that during the pandemic with members. Since COVID, we've seen a spike in overwork. Some offices reduced the number of employees, either through use of the furlough scheme or through redundancies, leaving the remaining staff to pick up the slack and implementing pay cuts with no intention to reimburse the money at a later stage. Working from home also blurs the boundaries between your work life and your personal life ever more. And I think what a lot of people that have participated and joined SAW in the last couple of years during the pandemic have been assessing is what it is that they actually value and want from their lives. You know, it's not just about what they want from their work lives, but how much do they value their personal time and their personal space, how much they want to give that away. So these lessons are kind of, they're coming through, and I think it's there's really positive movement that I find very exciting. In the UK, it's very common that all of our employment contracts more or less have this request for us to opt out of the 40-hour working week time directive, European directive. And it's not something that we have to do, but most people end up signing away their rights to these things. So learning about your rights with respect to overwork is super important. The second aspect that was identified through the inquiry is the issue of underpay, and I think undervalue is appropriate to say here as well. As well as increasing individual worker productivity through the long hours, practices increase their efficiency and their profits by keeping our wages low. And it's often the case they don't want us to talk about our wages openly and transparently with our co-workers, because that creates issues for them about, you know, when people ask for higher earnings, etc., etc. So transparent pay structures is a really good first step to, you know, bridge pay gaps and equality in the workplace and improve standards for all in the first instance. But without a union representation and a strong collective voice from the workers, we're not in a position to negotiate higher earnings for all. And employers are much more incentivised to cut fees and undercut other practices to win a new commission than they are to pay their staff higher wages. And they can get away with that because it is something that for many years has gone unchallenged. So to understand that the business model of many practices is reliant on free labour, on exploitation of our time and through, you know, unpaid overtime, you have to ask yourself how many practices would actually fall into administration without the money that we inject into their business. Alongside this, we're seeing a worryingly sharp increase in the amount of unpaid internships in architectural practices. Since COVID, a large percentage of workers have been facing pay cuts, and with the rises to inflation in the last year and the cost of living, our wages are remaining stagnant whilst the cost of living increases. So we are getting poorer out of the back of this pandemic. And that's why graduates like yourselves or architectural workers as a whole really need to stick together so that this doesn't become a race to the bottom. Unstable employment and precarity causes a form of anxiety that's useful to the architectural establishment and that keep us motivated. In the current market, labour is cheap and workers are easily replaceable, which creates a sense of urgency and competition, and it forces us to keep pushing at the expense of our well-being. Members of SAW have recently asked to reduce their notice periods from 3 months to 1 week, which makes them much easier to dispose of. Office culture. Our employers exploit our dedication. They siphon our enthusiasm into unpaid overtime for the good of their balance sheets. And it's imperative that as students and graduates, we collectively challenge unfair employment conditions. Within offices, a pressurised competitive environment is promoted. Individualism, competition, one-upmanship, and office banter often create a hostile environment for workers and for collective organising. Now that many workers are working from home, we've had reports of bosses using audio and video conferencing software as modes of surveillance and opportunities to monitor their staff. There's more isolation and there's larger barriers that get in the way to collective organising when this culture of fear and alienation is widespread. And the toxic office culture is, of course, just an outcome of something that we're taught at university, toxic teaching culture. Competition is very much taught to us. Maybe you guys can tell me that University of Waterloo is different, but how many times have you heard your tutors say, you may need to work over the Christmas break to catch up with this? Are you, or changing your designs very last minute before a review so that you have no choice but to pull all-nighters? And as I said, I touched on earlier, the profession becomes exclusionary as a result of that. University culture lowers our standards for ourselves and it lowers our self-esteem. Why would you question unpaid overtime when you enter the workplace after you're so used to doing all-nighters throughout your training? And in recent times, throughout the pandemic, many of us came to recognise that our bosses have a complete lack of care for physical health as well as mental health in some places. We witnessed members who were compelled to continue working from the office despite having facility to work remotely, and staff being asked to put themselves at serious risk of illness during the height of the pandemic and its strictest lockdown measures for no other reason than to satisfy their bosses' anxieties. The pandemic caused workplaces to become places of danger, but as described earlier, we saw a lot of people coming together over this realisation and saying no and making sure that this wasn't the case. So we've seen members take action, stand up to their bosses, not only in the situation of an unsafe condition, but now in relation to claims over bullying, over sexism, over issues of pay. We're seeing all sorts of practices up and down the UK starting to take steps and action towards challenging these behaviours. So what is it that you can do to make these changes in your own performance within the profession? I think firstly, it's important to recognise that the law is not enough to protect your working rights and your personal freedoms. The law doesn't protect you from the varieties of exploitation or unfair treatment that you might encounter in the workplace. Knowing the law is a good first step, and knowing how to use it to your advantage is crucial. Make sure that your boss isn't breaking the law in your own practice. You'd be surprised how frequently this actually happens, and they do. But be aware that the law is a minimum standard and not the benchmark for where you set your expectations. To achieve resolutions to the problems that we've discussed in this presentation, the onus is on us as a collective to change that performance from the ground up. You can become part of a union like SAW or equivalencies in North America, the architecture lobby, and build a community around you that focuses not only on advocating for change, but on implementing it in practice. Talk to your peers, break down that culture of competition. Organising starts with a simple conversation and a build-up of trust. Don't wait until you're in a position where you feel helpless or like you need a union to come as a third party to help you. Be proactive rather than reactive and part of the change that you want to see in the profession by participating actively in the remodelling of its future. When we're unionising, we're acting on the belief that our power comes from each other and that we're working towards a shared aim together. Unlike our bosses, whose power depends on financial coercion or punishment, our power comes from strong relationships and unity. These relationships are built on listening, transparency, and trust. And within SAW, being part of a community like that, we get access to resources, training, shared knowledge, employment law information, workshops about redundancy, working practices and rights. There's also socials, legal support, representation should you require it in employment tribunals. So I'll leave you with this note. It's one from Jane McAlevey. High participation is a prerequisite to power. The only way that we make the change happen that we want to see is by being courageous enough to step up and be a part of it and to work together to implement that change.
Thank you so much, Keri. That was amazing, very informative. And thank you again, Jess, for your presentation as well. And I'll just start with a question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and if they have questions. And I have many questions, so we could be sitting here for hours. But I just wanted to kind of like start with a kind of a reflection of like what this talk series of kind of like this Praxes of Care and talking about care in architecture. And also just kind of prefacing that with the fact that what's been amazing, at least in the past couple of years, seeing more movement in this front in the architectural world, that it is a global thing, that it doesn't seem to be, and the fact that, Jess, you're from New York, Keri from the UK, we're based here in Toronto and Cambridge, Canada. And I'm sure a lot of people that listen in and are listening to these conversations, they can relate to it. And I've personally gotten many messages from people in different parts of the world. So it's a very real issue in most parts of the world, as far as I've seen. And I just wanted to sort of like ask you too what your thoughts are on how you define care in architecture and how it relates to this conversation that we're having about unionization, about unethical work practices, and whether it's within, and I love that you brought in the pedagogical angle, because I do believe it starts there. We're kind of brewing people for unethical practices. So how, what does, care mean to you within architecture, and how can we define it? How can we talk about it and communicate it more effectively? And for those who are in positions of power, to actually take more care, to actually pay attention to these things through that lens. So I just wanted open it up with that, and to both of you, either of you, whichever wants to start.
Yeah. Well, I think to start, I want to make clear that that it's important to understand that sometimes the terms like care or decolonization or social equity and inclusion become sort of have the life and the meaning sucked out of them by kind of this corporate and institutional use, right? So now like care and equity and like decolonization are just being applied willy-nilly to anything, you know what I mean? So for example, like I think it's important to decouple care from things like good intentions, right? So for example, as we saw in June of 2020, plenty of architecture firms released statements saying things like, you know, we stand with anti-racist work, you know, we are for Black Lives Matter, things like this. And like those things are interesting to hear, but often they don't come with grounded and real commitment. So I think you have to think about care in terms of like, how are you going to show and prove that, right? As opposed to like, I'm just going to say, you know, how I feel that our firm is a family, or to say things like, oh, you're such a rock star for staying here so late. You know what I mean? If anyone is calling you a rock star at work, you are being exploited. I think that needs to be made clear. But to think about it also in grounded relational terms, right? How do you show up for your peers, and how do your peers show up for you? So one of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was a student was from a former TA of mine who now has her own firm called the New Affiliates, Evie Diamantopoulos, said to me, you know, people often feel that they need to scrabble and compete to like suck up to the most famous professor in their department, or to like suck up to their partner. And she's like, I'm going to tell you right now that the people that you need to make the strongest network with is your peers, because you have no idea where they're going to go. You have no idea what's like, how they're going to turn this research or their work into their lives, right? So if you turn up in a honest, open way with people, not an understanding of relation as I need to use you to get to this point, right? Which can often be a way that people talk about organizing, right? I'm going to have this conversation, I'm going to have this ask, I'm going to have this conversation with this person, and I'm going to get them to do what I want them to do, right? And then I'm not going to see them as an important part of the way that I put together the way that I put together, you know, an equitable workplace, but rather saying, instead of seeing other people's cross purposes, let's say, or what might seem as cross purposes as something that you need to get over, like, this person doesn't believe that the workplace should unroll exactly in the way that I do. They are the lumpen proletariat. I'm going to just try to manipulate them into doing what I need them to do, and that's how we're going to win our contract. By winning the contract, you're agreeing to be in community with that person long term, right? So how are you going to show up in that relationship? And also, if you're in the beginnings of a union drive, if you're the person who's been sending shitty emails for years, you're probably also not the person who's going to be able to have that conversation with your colleague about, oh, I think that we should start a union, right? So think about that now. How are you behaving with people now? How are you behaving with people in your studio work? How are you behaving in people on your internship? How do you communicate to people when you are in a moment of frustration with them? That's why I talk about things like community gardens, right? Because I've worked with, you know, the aunties in my community garden for the last 2 years. They can be very annoying, bless Brenda's heart, but we all want the same thing. We're all trying to do this sort of really very radical produce distribution program in the neighborhood. And all of you want that thing. All of us want that thing. And even if that person is not showing up or speaking in a way that you recognize their politics is aligned with yours, it doesn't mean you get to throw them away, right? You're still going to be in relation with them. So I think that's the first place I would start when thinking about care, is how are you making it concrete?
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add to that, Jess. I totally agree. I think there's also another component about caring for yourself, which is so lacking in how we behave. It's like our needs are something that is frequently secondary to the job, and that in itself is just ludicrous and needs to change. So a bit of care about ourselves. And also, I often encounter workers who have reached this point of burnout and stress, and it's very easy for the culture of the office environment or the establishment of management to sort of spin that round and make it seem like that's an issue with the individual and the worker rather than a kind of wider issue of how the practice is structured. And that lack of care for yourself comes into that there, because it leaves you vulnerable to believing that the problem is with you. So I think that's a kind of interesting point. And also, if you're having this relational situation with your peers that's so vital to organising, I think there has to be a level of willing from people, and I often find this a barrier with organising, a sort of willing to put your neck on the line for someone else. Like, you really have to be, you may have this shared goal, but in some circumstances, you might find one of your workers as being, or one of your colleagues as being treated more badly than you, or has a particular circumstance where they are affected more by the conditions of the underpay or the overwork, or they're being bullied or something like that. And often it's harder to incentivize people to actually rally around and support in that situation. So if there's ever an incident in your workplace where you see someone else struggling, take that seriously. Take care in those situations and see it as your problem, because ultimately one day it could be.
Yeah, that's great responses, and I feel like that leads me to a question of this fear that people would have, that is that employees would have, or coworkers could potentially have, of speaking up and actually showing that care. And how can people, because I've come across many, like whether it's students or architectural workers that believe a certain way and they speak about it in private, but they have this fear of repercussions, obviously. And that's where, the union is important. So, but until you actually get to the union, once there is a collective, what are your thoughts on sort of like actually speaking up about these things and not being afraid to get fired? Because even like to bring up the conversation from unionizing in the unionizing efforts at SHOP in New York. So I know that like that is also a fear of losing your job. You're speaking up, and this will actually have a large impact on the profession itself. But how can you how would you encourage, like, what are the things that we can look into that people can sort of get over that fear in order to collectivize?
Well, honestly, the first thing to do is to take that fear very seriously. You know what I mean? It's not as if people are afraid with no reason to be, right? As Keri was talking about in her presentation too, like people are retaliated against. People are fired and treated as replaceable, right? So one thing to acknowledge is not to just say, oh, architects are so self-serving that's the reason why, you know, they haven't spoken up. People, as I was saying in my presentation, people have a very intimate knowledge of their own material circumstances, right? And if you're on that visa, or you have that debt, or those are real and present fears. So often the first thing to do is to think very strategically, right? And it can be as small as sort of understanding like the racial dynamics in your firm, for example. If you are a person in a more, let's say, privileged or close position to the partners, often because there's a demographic reflection between you and the partners, right? Do you understand that condition? Do you understand that politic? And how do you use that privilege to shield or to challenge abuse from your directed towards your colleagues? It's often about, especially before there is a union in place, especially before, you know, you have that guaranteed protection. It is a strategy game of understanding the power dynamics, right? Like who is in the best position to speak. And if you already have this sort of collective piece brewing, something that, you know, we often call an organizing committee in your firm, I think it's important to have that strategic mindset, right? I think that often there is a desire to have like a big, present and visible win immediately, or like a really flashy confrontation, you know, with supervisors that pays off immediately. But unionization work is often very slow work, right? And it relies on that relationship building, that slow relationship building first, and also that strategic understanding of power in your office, of not asking the more vulnerable people in your firm who may have a more immediate understanding of the exploitation at play, right? So they may even be the first people to sign on for a union, but not expecting them to come out on a limb first, right? So I think, again, it's employing a level of strategy there, and a level of understanding of the power and the politics that are at play in your office, really having an intimate understanding of that, because it will help you in your organizing effort.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's absolutely risk in, there are so many people in precarious situations, and there is a risk of being retaliated against by taking these first steps. Oftentimes though, when we're at a point with a group of people who want to collectivize, there's a certain fear the other way, that they can't continue in this position that they've been in, that's starting to become an unsustainable space. And often there might be instances of victimization or harassment or bullying that's underpinning this like desire to start to take some action and challenge the system that they're in. So sometimes it helps to situate that fear in that sort of space of, well, you know, there may be risk this way, but actually you're also at risk in this sense as well, because the law isn't protecting you. The law isn't protecting you, and becoming part of a community of people who are there to support you gives you so much more power and strength to deal with this complex and horrible position that you might already be in your workplace. And I think there's a fine balance there between people we meet who want to stay in a practice and fix these problems, and some that say, no, I've just gotten to the end of my rope with this, I can't keep going, I'm gonna leave now. But either way, there's risk associated with all of these decisions, and as Jess says, it's a slow process of building trust. And you know, we often find people really hard to their HR teams or their management teams and bosses to say, I need this changed, and please can I get this, and you know, I don't want to live like this anymore. And they've just become stigmatized, right? So it's like all that energy you have to change, something has to be redirected into the building the structures and the network and the trust amongst your colleagues and your peers to actually make that power and take you out of this fearful situation that you're in.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I really appreciate the responses, and it kind of, it makes me also think about like, well, kind of like the response of one of the rebuttals that people use in any sort of situation that is related to unethical work practices or overtime or the culture in architecture that, you know, this is why I'm in it or whatever, has been the one aspect of it that I just kind of want to, you know, get your thoughts on, because I'm sure there are people that potentially are listening or will listen to this and will have heard this with in an architectural setting, whether it's in university or from other students or professors or even employers and co-workers, of how you kind of like, you know, this is all part of the grind. You got to put in the work. I did it and I worked for free at OMA for whatever, or I busted my butt at OMA for this many years and now I have my own practice. And it's kind of part of the process. You kind of got to go through it in order to make it, whatever that making means. And then kind of discounting, also secondary to that, I guess, question, or I want to get your thoughts on, is this idea that all these efforts for unionization and calling out toxic environments being seen as a response from many employers that I've actually spoken with, saying that it is, we need this, like we need the public to understand the value of architecture first. And if the public understand it, then we get paid more and then we can pay our staff more. So the first question is, we need to educate the public on architecture. And until that happens, we cannot create, like we don't get paid enough to actually provide above, you know, living wages. So, and I've heard these things, but from people that I know and I don't know, and it's I always find them problematic. So I want to get your thoughts on it, and within your context, I'm sure potentially you've heard something similar, and how you kind of deal with that.
Yeah, I think there may be a kind of, there's definitely a space for pushing a kind of external agenda with, you know, government and, you know, lobbying for change in the built environment in that sense. But I do think that a lot more power can still come from a sort of grassroots movement up, and that we have more influence over that situation than we might like to believe in the first instance. I think there is a benefit in keeping a sense of, you know, if in a country like Scotland, where I am just now, there's like, you know, there's a few architectural practices where that do a certain kind of job, right, and are of a certain scale. And if those practices all had workers that were unionised, then they would have no choice but to kind of set a higher threshold for their fees, because their staff demanded higher pay. And that does, I think, have an immediate ripple effect. I think that, you know, people or professions that have a strong union presence and a collective voice have that better working standard and condition, and as a result the work is better for it, rather than educating the public and kind of doing this in reverse to make the standards better for others. So it's definitely a complex question, but for me the main body of the work in that respect is from a sort of bottom-up strategy.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that because I mean, firstly, thinking about contracts in the United States, right? The contracts with clients themselves are often awful, right? Are often relying when you sign that document on you are factoring in the amount of unpaid hours that are required in order to pull that off because you've sort of essentially underproposed what the actual value of the work of the labor that goes into that contract will be. And while so you are not allowed in the United States to fix certain prices, right, across as the standard for the sector, but as a union, you are allowed to start setting those standards. So in a way, having that bottom up capacity sort of leapfrogs that understanding of we need to educate the public first. And at the same time, you know, when I used to work as a organizational strategist for architecture firms, I did interviews with people at all levels of firms of various sizes. And a part of it, of what you hear is, you know, I'm an architect making 65K a year, and I am working overtime to save money for my developer client making 900K a year, you know? So it's like I'm donating my wages in order to make that happen. And that is not sustainable because it's also not sustainable for principals, right? It's not sustainable for firm owners either. This continuous race to the bottom isn't really serving anyone. And as it pertains to educating the public, it also requires an expansion of what is thought of as architectural work. So I often ask my students, if you sit down with your parents and you ask them what they need a doctor for, can they tell you? Yes. If you sit down and ask them what they need a lawyer for, can they tell you? Yeah. If you sit down and ask them what they need an architect for, they will tell you that they do not need one, right? Because there is an understanding, at least in the United States, that architecture is a luxury good, right? Because what we see, or what the public sees, is the Hudson Yardses of the world. And are like, that is what architecture is, right? But if we architects ourselves also validate work like, are you sitting on a zoning board and thinking about different standards for public housing? Are you interrogating alternative models for development? Can you think about community work as more than showing up for a couple of sessions with Post-its and then disappearing from people's lives, right? And without sort of manifesting what that work and time and conversation did. I think that there is a need, one, to expand on what we think about and validate and reward as architectural work, which goes a long way into educating the public as to what architects do, because I do think that architectural knowledge can be applied to a much wider set of concerns than what it is applied to right now, right? Or what it is, quote, to some extent profitable to apply it to. So I think there's that piece as well. And also, wait, the last thing I wanted to mention is that unions can also very publicly advocate for policy. So if I'm thinking about the Service Employees International Union, you have the nurses of the Service Employees International Union lobbying for healthcare reform. You have the teachers union in Chicago lobbying for education reform. There are so many aspects of the built environment that organized labor in architecture can add its weight to, can add its power to, and it is so much more effective to do that when you are organized already. So these are ways of adding that muscle to this understanding of the public good of architecture.
Yeah, 100% agree. I want to open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and ask your question, or you can type it in the chat. Right, we've got a question from Frank. As students who will soon become future architectural workers for the first time, in what ways do you think we can work with the conflict between our position as a newcomer in a position of inferior experience and as a person entering into a class relation of employment under wage labor who must defend our rights and interests?
So, sorry, the question is, how do you work with the conflict between positions of newcomer and yet still defend your rights and interests? Well, I think it's implicit in what we've been saying, that it's about that connection with peers. You know, you're certainly in a situation that feels precarious. You're even using the word inferior in relation to your experience, despite having, you know, gone through a full process, a lengthy and arduous process at architecture school to become incredibly skilled and trained and knowledgeable. So I understand that there's an element of feeling that you might still be on a kind of lower rung within the practice, but you have an absolute right to fair pay, to fair working conditions, the same way anyone else in the practice would have. And your level of risk right now might be, it might feel intimidating if you're in this kind of, you've newly entered the profession, but those who have accumulated many years of experience within the profession might feel that they have a lot to lose by making these moves towards unionising. So the crossover there in terms of fearfulness or precariousness actually extends between you and all levels of staff, I think, in your workplace. And you need to reach out to make those connections with your employees, colleagues, sorry, and break down that system of validation that Jess spoke to earlier about, you know, feeling a need to impress your boss, feeling grateful that you have a job in the first place, that you're giving your skills and your labour to a place, and that you should work very hard to show your worth. You already deserve your place in the practice and have shown your worth. And if you can show it to yourself in the first instance, then you can defend your position, I think, more robustly.
Yeah, again, I would agree. And I don't have an enormous amount to add, but to not think about it as it's me, myself, defending myself alone, right? Because that puts you in the most precarious position, really, to begin building these networks. So thinking about groups like SAW, thinking about groups like the lobby that you can join in order to start building those networks. So when you enter practice, it is likely that, you know, it's definite that it's going to be the working conditions that we have now, but the motion is towards this, the relationship building that you're doing is towards that organized work, right? So often you're coming into an office having no relationships with your colleagues yet, but what you want to do is to be working in a way where you're building those relationships with your colleagues as your first step, right?
Great, thank you. And to add to that, the Toronto chapter of the architecture lobby, there is a specific group dedicated to unionizing, which is led by Juliana Kanishi, who made the beautiful poster. So get in touch. Next question from Maxwell. You both mentioned undercutting fees in the proposals for projects and competitions. Are there other systems that distribute projects to architectural practices that avoids putting the employees at risk of overwork?
I mean, there's certainly there's competition law that requires transparency in the way that we procure work, that demands a level of, you know, it demands us to kind of produce pre-qualification material to say that we, you know, practices qualify for a certain type of job. I'm sure there's something similar in the States, but that still requires, you know, it's private practices requiring to put forth a fee, and they have ultimately some control over the numbers that they put to that. I think it comes back to this question about workers being able to influence their boss's decision in that scenario where they say, well, we just can't make the numbers work because we've had to pay our staff more money because they demanded it. So there's always, as long as there's private practice, I think there's always a level of competition required in that bidding for work process. But certainly in the UK, there was a large culture in the 60s of public ownership over architectural work and local authorities being in charge of a lot of development that did negate this private kind of clash of numbers and fee cutting that is quite interesting to me. How we publicly procure architectural services is a way that could start to break down some of those dynamics in winning work.
Yeah. So again, this is a future scenario, but having union density, so having a high level of unions within the private sector begins to normalize that fee structure. You can also look to models like Sweden, where employees have a union and then employers have their own union that protects them from exploitation from clients.
And I would add that timing is also always an issue too. Aside from fees, a lot of architects and architectural offices commit to deadlines that just are not feasible, so they end up overworking people and their employees. So that it's just project management is another end. It looks like John Macdonald has their hand up.
Thanks very kindly. I am an employer, head of a practice here in Ontario. And endorse and have been involved in efforts to ensure that our Provincial Employment Standards Act can apply to working professionals and those training to be working professionals. But I just want to point out to everyone, and I can only speak to our own experience here in Ontario, in Canada, that the moment that you join the Ontario Association of Architects as an intern, and onwards from there, as you become a licensed professional working within a practice or the head of a practice like myself that has a certificate of practice, that there are no employment standards. I have no obligation to pay an intern architect who is registered with the OAA a dime, ever. They have no right to refuse any amount of overtime. So we have to see this in context. So, we have led efforts several years ago to try to get some traction because the Employment Standards Act was being reviewed. That is now by the by, and it is not in fact happening. My own view of this is tempered by what I feel is our primary care, as I've noted in the chat, that our care is for the public interest. And for better or for worse, I think that our legal obligations as professionals have been designed essentially with a kind of view of personal legal liability flowing through the professional, where our care for the public interest, which is fairly narrow, don't kill anyone, buildings should not fall down, these kinds of things. We're talking about quality public space and a lot of qualitative things. That's not within the wheelhouse of our care for the public interest. It really boils down to some pretty narrow terms. But I think that it has flowed that we have to set aside our own personal well-being in order to care for the public interest. Now, this is a view that could be contested. It could be terrible, but I do think it's at the foundation of the flow from a self-governing profession to a professional and onwards then to the work. And it likely has to change, but within a legal environment regarding a professional's legal duty, we're talking about changing a history of common law that is centuries old at this point. So I just want to set the sort of real context for this, not to negate the efforts, and not to negate that, as practicing professionals, we are intermediaries but between the staff that do the work and work with us and are part of that offering to the public, and the public interest, which is unfortunately or fortunately the primary interest.
Well, then could I ask a question? Is the framework then that in order to create buildings that are not hazardous to the public, which by your definition is sort of the extent of what we're measuring as public good, so in order to construct a built environment that's not hazardous to the public, it requires labor abuse?
I'm simply pointing out that I think that is the existing structure. I'm not saying that it requires it. At our own firm here, for instance, we pay overtime, and we pay it regardless of whether you are a registered intern or a professional practicing architect. But I don't get paid overtime. In fact, I don't get paid in the first, just that's the reality here. So the context for this discussion is a structure within which that public interest is cared for first, and the practicing professional is cared for second, and must sacrifice him, her, or themselves to this to this public interest. And I think it plays into comments that you've made earlier about the culture of pedagogy, the culture of schools, where this individual sense of sacrifice to the idea, individual sense of sacrifice to the work is cultivated and can pretty quickly be abused by the employer to require the sacrifice, through the firm. And as you pointed out, this might affect the profit and the bottom line of the firm, or the amount of money that the developer takes home, as opposed to those who've created the offering to the public.
Just to add to that, so Jess and Keri know, like what John's referring to is it's actually written in the Ontario Association of Architects, like bylaws. So like the primary thing is to be working for the public interest. And that's a really good point, because I did want to, maybe you can speak to that, if there's a similar thing exists in New York or in the UK, where as a professional, like here, we're not legally entitled to overtime and time off, minimum wage, and all of that, because we're considered professionals. That's what he's referring to. He's not saying that's what he believes in. He's saying that's actually what's written in the structure of our licensing body, so which is quite problematic, which obviously goes down to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the UK, we've got REBA as the licensing body, and I think they are very far short of the mark, and interestingly seem to be a bit of a diversion tactic to certain workers who are looking for solutions to their problems. Say, oh, we'll challenge REBA and we'll try and get the rules changed for what REBA can do, and they can't really do anything. Is the real answer. In our experience, they don't have a huge authority, even though they have a large membership of architects. And again, it comes back to this issue of where do you want to channel your energy, and for me always comes back to the same thing, which is from the bottom up, from the workers coming together and from setting that standard and the benchmark of these for themselves. You know, the law doesn't protect you. Whatever the licensing body says doesn't protect you and doesn't set the appropriate standards. And you know, like, again, I think it's a kind of a diversion to say that the public interest is something that then becomes, like, you know, higher than the workers' needs. You know, it's like the public interest is going to be negatively affected if architects are overworked and burnt out and make mistakes or are, like, you know, underpaid, etc., etc. It's just common sense stuff. So I don't see how that in any way negates the kind of really critical and urgent needs to have better labour rights within the profession.
Yeah, I think similarly in the US, there are restrictions on overtime at a national level for workers who are professionalized and make more than $32,000 a year. However, it doesn't negate, as Keri is saying, organizing and unionizing and creating those standards within your office. So what it ends up doing is making it so every office has to have their own effort, right? As opposed to creating a national standard. But again, that should not stand, as Keri is saying, that should not be a deterrent from doing that organizing work, right? Because it does create, that union density would create the power to start building certain standards that would also benefit the public good. So for example, building codes in the United States, and if you know much about the US, you know how we feel about regulation. We don't love it. But even the minimal amount of regulation in the United States, or the minimum amount of that ends up protecting a resident or a user. If you saw in the news recently, there was a huge fire in the Bronx that burned down a building in a West African immigrant community that ended up killing 17 people, including a number of children. One of a number of reasons why that building burned down was because of code violations. And that is not necessarily what's being carried as the narrative about that fire, right? So things like fire doors, for example. So the mayor of New York made a speech talking about, you know, the fire wouldn't have been so bad if the door had, if people who were fleeing had closed the door behind them, and stopped the smoke from billowing through the building. Which, when you're fleeing from a building that's on fire, it's pretty much the last thing that's on your mind is closing the door behind you. So it's actually that the public doesn't totally understand that these standards are put in place to protect them. So the lobby is working on a statement to fully explain what the landlord did not do to keep that building to code. And it also turns out that that landlord is a donor to our mayor's campaign and also on his transition team into office. So there are, I think, a number of power there in the United States, sort of like a constellation of powers at play that create more harm for the public good. And by having an organized labor, having organized labor in the private sector and the architecture sector, you can actually exponentially increase both public knowledge of what those codes, regulations, and standards are, but also like really setting better standards for what they can be. No one should be risking their lives because they are in need of shelter. And that's something that an organized labor force that has the power to make those statements, that has the power to really, in the same way that nurses and teachers have, to challenge policy, can improve.
Thank you so much. We are a bit over time, and I could have this conversation for a lot longer because it's crucial. But I know, especially Keri, you are probably, it's like midnight or something there in the UK. Yeah. So I'll just give each of you maybe like 30 seconds, just like a final remark that if you'd like to make before we call it a day or a night.
Sure, I'd just like to say a really huge thanks for having invited us from SAW to come and speak with you tonight. I think there are huge reasons to be optimistic. We've seen a lot of energy around organising, and I see a change in younger people coming up through the profession. That gives me hope that there is something to look forward to in the future with the way the industry is going. I hope that this has been of interest and engaging to you. And although we are a UK based union and we can only give information on the legal rights in the UK, we do have sort of affiliated members in different parts of the world. So if you're interested in getting in touch with us, we're interested in network building, you know, that would be really great, and you can find out more about us on the website. But yeah, just to say thanks. I found it really inspiring. Jess, I really enjoyed listening to everything you've contributed, and yeah, thanks again. It's been good.
Yeah, again, thank you very much for the invitation and for the conversation. Thank you, Keri, for your presentation. I really enjoyed learning more about SAW. And yeah, I would say a concluding remark is just to really be invested in those relationships that you're building in practice. Those mean the world. And if you are still in school, think about how those relationships, how you're building them right now. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you for the engaging presentation, the conversation, and all the work that you're doing on a daily basis to advocate for all of us and everyone out there. So yeah, thank you so much. I've been learning a lot, and yeah, thank you for asking me to moderate this talk. It was the first time I've moderated a talk, so hopefully it was okay. But yeah, thank you for kind of ending it off on also like this positive, some things to be encouraged about, because it is encouraging to see others thinking about this, and it's hard work, and that building that camaraderie and kind of like disrupting architecture at its core and kind of killing this competition that we're instilling since school. And it's all around us, as you both mentioned too. So I hope this is kind of a reason to think about how we can practice differently, and how it's very much possible to actually practice differently, and at all scales. I think a lot of the talk was kind of revolving around larger scale organizing, like workers in larger firms. But I think it does begin, as you said, at the core with every individual architectural worker, regardless of where you're working. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you all for being here, and have a great evening. And thanks for all your questions. Nice meeting you, Jess and Keri. Hopefully we'll be in touch.